Great. Welcome to the fourth edition of Tokenomics Study Group discussing Helium today. Particularly excited. This is my favorite token, my favorite protocol. This is the one that got me from sort of casual tech bro with a couple of speculative coins to someone who I thought was being a person who I thought I could really use blockchain technology to do important things in the world. Helium kind of opened up my eyes to the possibility of blockchain being used for something that wasn't kind of financial speculation related and could make a real impact on public goods and public infrastructure. In the spirit of Tokenomics Study Group and our norms, I should say that I hold this token. So I have that as a potential bias. I also mine the token and have for some time. So I've become pretty familiar with the protocol over the last year or so and know people involved in the company for many years. So I have that both as an advantage in the conversation as well as you can take my my enthusiasm for the token with as much of a grain of salt as you think you need to, knowing all of that. Let's see, got a couple more people joining. We don't have a special guest speaker this time. It's just me. I think that as we evolve this this format, I'm sort of mixed on the guest speaker format. It's so great to have an expert here to help teach us things that we might not have been able to figure out ourselves. But whenever we have a guest speaker, it pretty quickly devolves into another fireside, and we lose a lot of the sort of interactivity and the opportunity to talk to each other and learn in a more engaged way, as opposed to a sort of sit back and absorb the wisdom, which is sort of like the default kind of pandemic online learning format. So hopefully this token study group and future token study groups will be able to be a little more engaged and interactive than a typical kind of like guest speaker fireside chat. Though of course it would be great to always have people in the room that know what they're talking about. And I'll admit that I don't work for the company and I didn't author this protocol. So there's definitely things that I might misunderstand and I may not know as well as some of you. And I think that that's kind of the spirit of this. So does anyone have any questions before we kick off? Vivek, do you want to offer any observations or guidance before we dive into sort of what is Helium and why it's interesting and start looking at all this stuff?
Yeah, just a small note. This Figma board is really well designed. It's meant to be a collaborative whiteboard that we use to gather our own thoughts and build upon each other's thoughts. So if you aren't in it yet, it's in the description for the event. Michael has put it together so graciously, and I think that we're trying to evolve the format in such a way that it fits that spirit that Michael described, which is even if we don't know all the answers, we can work towards figuring them out together. So that's all I have, Michael. I'm excited.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, again, evolving format. This whiteboard, the original inspiration was Holly, who's on the phone, who presented a great Figma diagram of Olympus a few weeks ago. And so I went looking for a way to continue to do diagrams of tokenomics. So I think it really helps to illustrate how a token actually works. And what I found, which is over in the orange box here on the left, is that some of our friends at the Token Engineering Commons use something called a stock and flow diagram as a way of modeling or illustrating token systems. And basically just says there's like a source and a sink, and then along the way they move around and they change hands and they get converted into things and they get stored in certain places. And that's something that's, I think, used in engineering and other contexts. I just sort of adapted it to Figma's graphic language. So our sources are yellow things, our sinks are orange things, things that convert things are green, and places that store tokens are purple, and then there's various arrows between them. And down here is an example of I think also from the Token Engineering Commons, of sort of how they use it, which is a token protocol with an augmented bonding curve, for those of you who've looked at that in the past. So I adapted that to our still getting used to this, to our discussion for Helium today, and just included sort of three main sections to the conversation that we can just bounce around between. So tokenomics diagram over here on the left, There's just sort of content that I grabbed from the web that's about what helium is. And then over here on the right are some questions that we can refer to if we're looking to get deeper into things. And please get into these questions yourself, add questions. I made a little pile of tokens down here at the bottom, which you can grab and drag up and put next to a question to sort of upvote it, so to speak, if you want to do that to highlight questions that you think we should be answering. But with all that introduction, any other questions or kind of process or anything before we actually start talking about helium itself?
One thing, Michael, you might already be doing this, but just to call it out, I'd be keen to get an introduction even before diving into tokenomics of just like what is helium, why would this particular type of decentralized network, and
Sure.
in general, yeah, like why is it interesting? I see this word that I don't know, which is LoRaWAN, I think.
Yeah, good one. Okay.
Which might help me even before looking at tokens. So
Cool. So a little bit of backstory. There's the reason. So the reason helium is interesting is because they build wireless data networks. So there's a lot of different kinds of wireless data networks. There's your phone has chips in it that can talk over all different kinds of radios. So like Bluetooth is a form of wireless data. Wi-Fi is a form of wireless data. Your 4G, talks over a whole bunch of different protocols of wireless data. And there's many, many, many more than that your phone doesn't use. For any form of wireless, like a data radio, which are what these little chips are, there needs to be a network. Otherwise, they can't talk to anything. And some of these protocols are peer-to-peer, like your Bluetooth in your phone talks to your Bluetooth in your headphones. But most of them are based, like a lot of radios, around base stations. And so your Wi-Fi is usually not a peer-to-peer protocol. You're not usually speaking over Wi-Fi from your phone to your laptop. Usually you're talking to the Wi-Fi hotspot in your home with your phone, and your laptop's talking to your. Oh, Romeo raised his hand. Go ahead, man.
No, I just want to compliment what you're saying about LoRaWAN and how, I mean, it's used in the real world. And so LoRaWAN, I think it's long range wireless area network. Mostly these are, for machine to machine communications with low bandwidth requirements, right? So I mean, we're using helium, as a proof of concept in two of our plants. So one in a cement plant and another one in a mining aggregate plant. And we use it most right now for feeding vibration analysis, so vibration analysis and resonance, as well as CO2 and environmental information. But again, those require very low bandwidth, and you don't need to be connected all the time. But the good thing about LoRaWAN is that it's long range. And so, I mean, we can call our plant is 50,000 acres worth piece of land, right? And so we can cover a good percentage where we have devices or IoT devices to connect to the to the network.
So it's cool. That's a really neat application of that. And so I guess to come back to helium just more generally, if you want to build a radio network, you often need to have base stations. But if you want people to build base stations, then you want to have users. And so you have a kind of a classic network chicken egg problem where what's going to happen first? If you have a cellular network, if you have a 4G or 5G or something in your phone, there's a company like AT&T or Verizon or Orange or whatever your major telcos are in the part of the world where you live, that's going out and putting up antennas on tops of buildings and on towers, and they spend a lot of money and a lot of time to do that, and they buy spectrum, and it's a whole gigantic process, and it takes a long time. It takes a lot of money. Helium wanted to offer this LoRaWAN radio for Internet of Things devices for the reasons that Romeo described, which is that there's tiny little sensors out in the world that don't have a lot of battery in them. And if you connected them to a cellular network, like a 4G network, they'd run out of battery really quickly. And then you'd need to replace their battery all the time, which doesn't work for a lot of applications. Helium started in cold chain monitoring, which is basically temperature sensors inside of trucks and things that are making sure that like a vaccine stays cold from when it was made all the way up to the point that it was that it was given to someone. So they wanted those tiny little sensors to stay online and not have to use tons and tons of energy. So they wanted them to communicate over LoRaWAN, which is this very low energy, low bandwidth protocol, as Romeo said, but there were no base stations to carry the LoRaWAN data. So they needed to figure out a way to get people to set up all these base stations. And they thought, well, a base station doesn't have to be like a big tower. It can just be like something kind of like a Wi-Fi hotspot sitting on someone's shelf. And I'll show you one here. I happen to have one. This is a new Helium hotspot in its box. I could take it out in a second. It's basically a Raspberry Pi with an antenna. And so what they did is they said, well, let's just get people to put these on our windowsills, or on their windowsills, and connect them to their Wi-Fi and connect them to their power, and then they can provide this LoRaWAN coverage. But there were a couple of tricks. One is they needed to convince people to pay for these things, which cost a few $100. And then they needed to be sure that if people were putting these things out there, that they were actually doing useful work. Like they were putting them in places where they would, reach they would cover a lot of area with their radios, and they'd be a valuable part of the infrastructure. And that's where the blockchain bit comes in, is they created their own layer 1 blockchain with their own token, and they issue people tokens for hosting these things in their houses. And they have a protocol, which we can get into, which you basically incentivizes people to put these things in the best possible places to mine the most tokens, so they provide the most coverage, but also disincentivizes people who might be trying to game the system or deploy these things in a way that aren't particularly useful. So maybe and sort of the proof is kind of in the pudding. They've been a company for like 7 years maybe, but they started deploying their hotspots just 2 years ago, and this is where they are. And that there's 300 something thousand of them now in the world, and at a few $100 a pop, and they're all over all over a lot of parts of the world so far. And I believe that this is the fastest a wireless data infrastructure has ever been deployed. And that's neat, because being able to deploy new forms of public infrastructure quickly and have them be owned by the community and decentralized is a really, really neat thing, not just for wireless data, but potentially for other things. I'm interested in transportation, and this is very inspiring to me. So I'll pause there. That was a longish answer to Vivek's question of why is helium interesting. It's interesting because it has successfully created a decentralized, real world public good very, very, very fast. And it's still going. So like they're still sort of adding to it. They're adding 5G to it and other things now. But why don't I stop there, and maybe folks that have questions about what that is, we could go there. Just dive right in.
Yeah, I think you described the cultural value of helium well, along with the technological value. So, I mean, one question that keeps popping up in all blockchain conversations is some areas just don't have internet access or access to infrastructure. So how do you think Helium and projects like Helium would try to solve that? The non-green parts of the map that we see. So how does Helium account for that?
Well, I would say that if you're talking about Helium's current application of LoRa, they're mostly piggybacking on existing networks. So I have a cable modem in my house in San Francisco, and this illustration here shows where the hotspot on my house in SF, like the yellow ones are the things the other hotspots that it talks to. So I just plug my Helium hotspot into my cable modem, and so I'm building on existing infrastructure. But if you lived in a part of the world where there isn't a lot of coverage, this is a way to, the Helium model creates incentives for people to deploy the hotspots in places where there is relatively limited coverage. And there's an algorithm for it. So if you deploy one now in San Francisco, where there's tons and tons and tons of Helium hotspots, it's kind of saturated and it's not going to earn very many tokens. if you deploy one out by like Lake Baikal and there's no other hotspots for us to talk to, you're probably also not going to earn that many tokens. But they've structured it in a way that if you put it in a place where the coverage is kind of thin, but it can still talk to other hotspots, that actually is sort of optimal. And so there's a gamified way. Like right now I have a bunch of hotspots in SF and I'm trying to think of new places I can put them because they're not earning very much anymore. And because so many people have set up hotspots in SF. So that, I don't know if that addresses your question, Sid, but it kind of speaks to this idea that Helium creates this incentive for people to deploy infrastructure in places where it's not. And you do ultimately have to connect it to the internet somehow, but the Helium hotspots can help you spread what coverage you have and extend it wirelessly. Right now it's over LoRa. Very soon it's going to include 5G and Wi-Fi too. So that would be maybe a way to speak to that. Did I get it?
So when it moves to, it perfectly answered my questions. So when it moves to 5G and other networks, how do the current licensing agreements of current carriers play into it? Because I think Freedom Fi has quite liberal licensing agreements, which let it run networks like Helium.
Yeah, so here's a Freedom Fi hotspot. Anybody,
Yeah.
sorry, my camera has like a focus thing on it. So anyway, we can take it out and look at it if you want. It's there. So the way they're doing 5G is they're not buying like national spectrum. In that case, it's more centralized. So they're teaming up with existing operators that have spectrum rights that they've purchased from their government, and then they're providing like additional coverage to those carriers. So in that sense, it's not as fully decentralized. LoRa WAN is pretty much unregulated or very lightly regulated in most parts of the world, whereas 5G is obviously very valuable spectrum. And so if you want to help extend a 5G network, you need to do it in partnership with someone who has purchased 5G spectrum. So when I put up a 5G antenna on my house, it won't be as decentralized as my LoRa antenna because I'll be earning money from a relationship that Helium has with like a licensed carrier in that context.
If I can chime in on that, Mike, a little bit again. So for Freedom Fi, they use public 5G, right? But there's also a technology called CBRS, and that is the private LTE or private 4G or 5G, where you can take advantage of that and deploy that for connectivity. So I think there are a lot of projects that Helium is working on around the CBRS. Yeah, it's a citizens band radio signal.
Yeah, that's correct. And this can get, because this involves radios as well as tokens and electronics, this can get pretty technical pretty fast. So I want to make sure that and actually we'll get out of my depth before we get too far into it, I think. But so it sounds like Romeo and Sid both have some real appreciation of sort of radios and licensing and the technicalities around that. But that's actually part of what makes this so interesting, is that we've actually these guys have taken something that mostly like a blockchain, which mostly lives digitally and financially, and they've been able to apply it to these interesting kind of real world radio challenges. Lisa, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Oh yeah, so I was just like trying to add it to the 5G question you guys are talking about. So I thought it makes sense, like for like a network like Helium to power LoRaWAN, but like for 5G, like I think the question I have is, say in the future, in an idealized future where like say every part of the world is covered by Helium 5G box, or like most part of the world, and then like why would getting bandwidth from your neighbor cheaper than getting bandwidth directly from the cell phone operator?
I think, well, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but the main advantage, at least at this stage with Helium, is not so much that the data, you're buying data for less, it's that you can buy data at all. So there's a kind of, in the sense that like most parts of the world don't have 5G yet. So so
Mhm.
Helium helps us get the 5G or the LoRaWAN or Wi-Fi to places that didn't have it, period. As opposed to sort of saying, hey, this is cheaper than your local carrier. It's just like there's a significant shortage of 5G antennas, and even in the United States, there's all huge parts of the United States that just don't even have broadband. Like we don't, you think of, there's rural areas of the US and as well as many other parts of the world that just don't have wireless data of any significant speed. So being able to accelerate the deployment of those antennas by creating incentives for people to put them out there, I think that's the first kind of criteria. And then to the degree that once there's Helium antennas and there's antennas that are owned by a centralized company, to the degree that they compete and Helium is able to underprice or something like that, I think you could make a case for that. But I think it's not as important as just the case that we need to expand wireless data coverage radically, and that Helium that's its main advantage is fast expansion, not so much like low cost.
A follow up to the question: if Helium has to partner with a telco company who already owns a 5G spectrum, so for places where say 5G coverage is not available, I would imagine there's these type of partners they can partner with to actually operate on 5G spectrum.
Well, in cellular, there's a lot of, I think maybe someone else on the call could explain it better, but you have spectrum that's licensed by a country. Usually a country will say, hey, we are the country and we own the radio waves in our country, and so we're going to license out the different bands to different applications. And then if you're a big company in the US, like a Verizon or someone, you buy a chunk of that spectrum, but then you have to go put towers out there and base stations in order to carry that spectrum. Usually, sometimes these companies do it themselves. Sometimes they partner with tower companies who are just in the business of putting up towers and putting up antennas, and then they rent those antennas to the company that's licensed the spectrum. And so in this case, Helium acts a little bit more like one of those tower companies. So they're not their own 5G brand. They don't have a national license, but they act as like a supplement to a company that does have the right to offer 5G. And so then that company, in this case, Dish Networks is the biggest one that's working with Helium so far. They contract with Helium and say, Dish says, well, we don't really have very many towers because we're just getting into 5G. Helium, can we work with you guys to carry signals for our customers? And so that's how, and Dish could go around sort of door to door saying, hey, would you put up a Dish 5G? Hey, would you put up a Dish 5G? But that could take a really long time. And and by working with the decentralized way and the incentives that Helium and the blockchain create, it allows those antennas to be deployed much more quickly. And then someone like Dish or Verizon or whoever else can come along and basically contract with Helium for that, for those antennas in a way, and they get built and maintained much faster than they otherwise would have.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Sid?
Yeah, Michael, unrelated. One of my friends is in the waiting room. Can you let him in?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I've lost track of that. Yeah, we have a guest who's not a kernel fellow, who's a friend of Sid's, who works in IoT, who's going to be sitting in for this conversation. Is it?
Yeah, so
yeah, go ahead, Sid.
Abhimanyu. So he's doing his PhD in blockchain in Barcelona, and he also works on the IOTA protocol, and analyzes various protocols. So.
Cool. Great. The welcome Abhimanyu to the kernel conversation. Maybe let's any other questions about sort of I'd sort of underestimated that how much kind of the practicalities of like radios and radio networks we should talk about. I'm glad that people are asking these questions because it's pretty fundamental to understanding why Helium matters. Helium matters at all. Any other questions on that before we get into this sort of the crypto aspects of it?
I think it's a great place to transition. The one thing that I would note, just like as we start getting into the economics, the real world cost that I see in a blog post from Helium, it says Freedom Fi expects the end-to-end 5G setup to cost between $1,000 and $5,000. depending on how powerful the 5G radio included will be, hosts will be able to earn a variable amount of HMT, depending on radio power, location, and amount of data traffic passing through their hotspot. So I think that, Michael, this is trending us towards like, okay, like if I'm gonna do this, how am I doing? How cost effective is it? Or is the model make sense for me as a miner, which you are one, so that's great.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting, maybe before we get into kind of like, the 5G ones are really expensive. The ones that I own, and then most of the 300,000 or so that are out there now cost in the kind of $300 to $400 a piece. Which is not cheap, but it's that's of the ones that are out there now. Most of the sort of like $300 to $400 price point. The 5G ones are significantly more expensive for a variety of reasons, and we talk about that later. But there is this. It does get to this question of like, what gives you the confidence that if you spend $400 on one of these things, or $3,000 or whatever it ends up being, that you're going to actually make that back and then some. And so maybe before we do like sort of hotspot miner math, we should just talk about like, what is the token, and like what are you earning? The quick answer is you're going to get paid in HNT, which is a Helium Network token. And then, well, like, what's that worth, and like how many are you going to get? And that part is kind of the complicated part. Does anybody want to walk through who's had a minute to look at it, and rather than me narrate it, which I'm happy to do? Has anybody given this some thought and kind of formed an opinion about like, how does this work? Like what is the, what are people getting paid for to do, and how does the token work? Happy to open it up to anybody else who wants to try to explain it to us.
If I would pitch in, I don't know a lot about it, but I did some data analysis on, let's say, on the block level in Helium. And I could clearly see that right now the influx of data from the real world devices, for example, the use cases, which is the end devices and IoT LoRa using the devices, which is pretty low right now. So it reminds me of the time when the Bezos chain used to be sort of like a zombie chain. The throughput was very less. But apart from this, I could see some trend. For example, in the middle of the nowhere, there are like 10, 15 devices, and all of them are let's say, witnessing each other, and thus making the rewards that way. Which I don't know how successful that model is, and how longer impact it would put on the token value, which is sort of a area where I have a lot of questions than the answers. If someone would like to touch that area also, that would really help.
Yeah, Abhimanyu, that's a great segue. Let me just underscore one point which you made right at the beginning. I want to make sure that people got it. This diagram shows different things for which the token is currently being distributed for. And the big blue bar in the middle is data transfer. And at the beginning, some amount, this is not quite to scale, in my impression, but like it was sort of to scale. This expresses the percentage of the token inflation that's allocated to different activities in the network. And what Abhimanyu said at the beginning of his point was that there's not a lot of data being carried on the network. That is to say that there's not a lot is an exaggeration. Like there's very, 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 very little data passing through the Helium network right now. And almost all of, just in terms of like dollar value, and most of what people are earning their coverage for, earning their HNT for, is for securing the network. which is hotspots talking to each other to verify each other's location. So I'm sort of giving away one of the sort of the points here, but that I didn't want Abhimanyu's point about how little data is actually currently being carried on Helium to get lost. Eventually, it should be enormous amounts of data, but at the moment, we're in the early days. That network is basically only 2 years old, and they had to build out all this network before they could begin to onboard significant numbers of actual data users of the network. And so the amount of data that Helium Network is carrying is growing really fast, but it's still pretty small. Does anybody else want to build on that or go deeper, add some data to it?
I put another drawing underneath the tokenomics diagram. Do you see that?
Yes.
Toward the bottom. Yeah. So that's also the Helium Flywheel that somebody put together in March, kind of showing. And then there's two charts, kind of a question about payback in days. If you buy a hotspot, this is not the 5G, but the regular hotspot that you were saying was between $300 and $400. Eventually, if you look at the left side of this diagram, the manufacturers begin to compete, and then they'll come up with lower hotspot prices, right? And then on the right, as more devices are using the network, more data credits are burned, and then the price of H&T goes up. So I thought that this might also help too in terms of understanding how these numbers all work. So
this is great.
Well, that reminds me of another question. Like, for example, if you consider the real value of let's say, a protocol, there is a point which is called as, I don't know, I think we call it uptick, like, that crossing of threshold where the real life value surpasses the, let's say, the investment in terms of both the project and protocol, as well as the supporting infrastructure, which in our case are mining nodes and validator nodes. So in this case, I think it's still very early and very difficult to put, let's say, a number on top of that. That, hey, after this certain point of time, if you're seeing this much traffic, then it means now the network is, let's say, ready to put a real value on it. So I don't want to end up in a situation where there are a lot of, let's say, zombie miners accumulating coin, verifying each other. But the real world, let's say, miners who are doing the heavy lifting for actually carrying data all over their sort of sub network are footing the bills for the people, let's say, who are doing some mining in remote Africa where there are no real use case IoT devices. And as far as I could see from their technical specs, they also have no plan in the future to, let's say, de-incentivize such adaptations. I mean, wisely, something like this could happen, and by looking at the price chart of H&T, I think it will happen soon. I don't know, like, if there is someone who can speak on this, it would be very helpful.
One question, and this is Michael. I'm not sure, Abhimanyu, if this answers the question. This would be the naive answer. If you scroll back up to just the distribution over time, is it true that, at the beginning, which is quite a long beginning, it looks like about 20 years, you can maybe get away with, Abhimanyu, what you're describing, the just passing data back and forth, but no real usage in a remote place. But then over time, the people that are getting rewarded is this big blue group, the ones where there's actual obvious data usage. So over time, like, this problem gets addressed. It's not a great answer to your question, and I'm just trying to figure out if I'm looking at this properly, because it seems like it'll take 20 years before some of that bad acting is cleaned up. But Michael, do you think I'm getting that right, or am I missing something?
Sort of. I think there's a small misinterpretation, which is that someone putting one of these things out in wherever. I wish I knew my Africa geography was better. I could say where these are, but but that is somehow a drain on the network, and that it's being sort of subsidized by folks in places with real coverage. That maybe a way to get a way to look at it differently is to try to understand what each of these bars is. So the protocol is issuing, it's an inflationary protocol, and it's going through a halvening now. So there's 2.5 million HNT are issued every month. And the way that it's distributed is roughly according to this colored chart that we're looking at right now. So maybe it's just worth going through the different chunks of the chart and understanding where the money is going. And then I think it'll help us understand this question of kind of which hotspots are doing valuable work and which aren't, and how they're being compensated and whether or not that's okay. So your first bar at the top is Helium Inc and Investors. So Helium is a C Corp with a bunch of VCs behind it, and they actually didn't start out as a crypto company. They became one about 3 years ago, and that and raised capital from different kinds of investors that were interested in their cryptoness. This is token issuance just straight to the company and its investors. So it's basically like compensation to Helium Inc that is doing most of the work on the blockchain, and to their investors for having funded them. Then you have the data transfer. And remember, this is a percentage of the tokens being issued, not an amount of data transfer. So there could be like 1 kilobyte transferred on the network in a particular month, and there probably was in the first month or so of the network being deployed, and whoever carried that kilobyte got all these tokens that month. So this is what is being allocated to data transfer. The light green triangle that folks were referring to a second ago is proof of coverage, and I think we should come back to that because that's one of the most interesting aspects of how this system works, and it speaks to this question of, are any hotspots sort of cheating or freeloading or not? And then this kind of darker green bar at the bottom is the consensus group, and that one's pretty easy to explain in the sense that there are cloud hosted validators that stake a bunch of HNT and play a very traditional consensus function of sort of ordering blocks, and it works Helium is its own layer 1 blockchain, but it works very similarly to the way like another proof of stake blockchain would work. Is there's just some data center computers that are earning earning tokens for faithfully ordering the transaction in blocks. But proof of coverage is interesting, and is a very special thing to Helium. Does anybody want to take a crack at what proof of coverage is?
I will try to give you a break, Michael, but no promises that I will get this right.
I'm going to help you.
Perfect. So proof of coverage is basically a challenge that hotspots are able to issue to one another to be able to demonstrate that they are actually connected and contributing to the network. And so I think that it was once every 30 blocks or once an epoch, a hotspot is able to issue a challenge to be able to demonstrate that it is still faithfully contributing to the network. And it does that by sending radio waves out to other hotspots who then confirm that it is contributing to the network. And then both the challenge issuer and the challenge confirmer all receive some distribution of the tokens from that block. How'd we do?
I think you got that right, but who cares?
Who cares? I guess that is basically what is securing the network. If like people are able to cheat and get HNT tokens without actually providing network coverage, then the whole thing falls apart.
Boom. Okay.
I can chime in a little bit, Mike, on that. I mean, the Helium network uses those miners, those hotspots, as servers, as Ethereum or Bitcoin would use servers. And so in this particular case, it's actually using those miners, those hotspots to to have the consensus, right? To validate that, the activity within the network is actually through that mechanism of the blockchain, right? Because again, at the beginning they started with Raspberry Pis, like an open source that you can actually build your own, and you don't have to spend $500 to buy a hotspot. I mean, they stopped doing that because there are a lot of people who are actually trying to also abuse that. So, but what it is what they call the proof of witness. Is what is similar to what a server or a miner would do, except in the form of a hotspot.
Yeah, a small asterisk, which is that Helium actually does now host validators in the cloud that are staked and do the kind of conventional vetting of like transaction sequencing. But this function, which you're both agreeing on, is the hotspots they are mining. But in this case, mining doesn't just mean like this is how they get the tokens. It means that this is the work of security of the network. This is how they prevent people from gaming the system. And like in this case, gaming it isn't double spending a Bitcoin, and the work isn't burning a lot of electricity to break some hashes. It is checking to see if other hotspots are where they say they are and able to talk to other nearby hotspots, and therefore presumably able to provide useful coverage and do useful work in the network. This is my favorite thing about Helium. This is so fucking clever. It's like really, 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 really neat, because I'm a bad teacher. I should let you guys figure this out for yourself, but we only have so much time. So I'll just tell you, in my opinion, the coolest thing about Helium is that they translated crypto proof, the work of proving, into the spatial, physical, real world. Boom. And we can now, having said that, maybe we can get back to, like, so this is my hotspot here in San Francisco. When it gets challenged by another hotspot somewhere else in the world, that hotspot sends a packet through the internet, hands it to my hotspot and says, hey, send this out right now. And then when you get it back, send it back to me. And so my hotspot's like, all right, cool. And it fires out this encrypted packet. And then it waits for it to get that packet back from a bunch of the hotspots nearby. And when it does, it sends it back to the hotspot that challenged it, which is in some other part of the world. And then that hotspot opens up the packet and says, okay, who else saw this packet? Like, did the other hotspots in the Bay Area that are supposed to be near Michael's hotspot, did they see this packet that Michael sent out, or did they not? And if enough other hotspots out here saw the packet that I sent out, then the hotspot that challenged my hotspot can be pretty sure that my hotspot is actually more or less where it says it is, and that it's up on the roof of my apartment providing useful coverage to the Bay Area. But if it were in my basement next to 50 other hotspots, just like collecting HNT and doing nothing of particular value, and there are people out there who do this and try to game the system, then that challenge should come back false, and it should the system should know that I'm trying to get HNT for not adding value, which gets back a little bit to Abhimanyu's point and Vivek's point about no one is like cheating unless they're like truly not in a place where their radio could conceivably carry data from a sensor or from some other customer of the network. So even if you're in Luanda or something like that, you've got your hotspot on your windowsill, it's there ready to carry data should someone with a contract with Helium or one of Helium's partners pass by with a sensor that's trying to send some data over LoRaWAN or later 5G or Wi-Fi or whatever. This hotspot is going to earn a lot less of this blue bar than a hotspot in New York City, but it could still earn some of this proof of coverage by maybe talking to the 3 other hotspots in Luanda, and just continuing to verify that they're there and that they're waiting for the network to arrive and to expand. And that's that's A, really clever, and B, it's this part, this triangle, this purple triangle is what allows the company to bootstrap the equity that it needed to hire all these expensive engineers and run the business. And this green triangle is what allows them to bootstrap the network. And this is the chicken egg. This triangle is not shaped like a chicken or an egg, but it solves the chicken egg network problem for Helium. Any questions about that?
Yeah, I think so. My point. Okay, let me rephrase it. The thing is, these miners, they are still playing by the rules, but the rules right now they are mostly for adoption than the real world use cases, and we are, let's say, far away from even from the middle of it than the end. So we'll be facing a lot of drastic protocol level changes, of course, because otherwise it might not sustain in the longer run. But it's a very low probability. So I mean, but the thing is, so this HNT distribution chart, it's like theory and practice, because in theory it should work like this, but in practice you have to mold all your protocol and design to abide by the rules. For example, the incentive award sort of arrangement in the long run. So I think with the time, it now really actually depends upon how much engineering efforts they put into the project to make it, let's say, gain the right amount of attention and adaptation, because literally, like, they are going to have a monopoly over such type of networks in the longer run, because they already have like more than 300,000 devices.
The monopoly point is an interesting one. Network effects are really powerful, and they've gone and built this rather large network, and they are growing it. I think it's supposed to add another 1 million hotspots in like the next year or so. Maybe just for fun, and I realize I come at this from a different perspective of some other people, but as an entrepreneur, one of the things that I think about sometimes is, what does it cost to build a business? Like how much money needs to get raised, what needs to get paid for. And I'm curious if anybody might have asked themselves, and I actually haven't yet, so we'd have to do the math live, but if anybody already knows the answer of what is the value, like how much has it cost Helium Inc to build a 300,000 hotspot network around the world? Anybody want to take a crack at that? How much does it cost the company?
0.
Yeah, kind of, right? But like,
yeah,
they did raise $111 million. Is that right?
that's okay. So that's another answer. So 0.
I would say in percentage 0 something, in percentage, not like in real one. But if you look at the percentage of devices sold by a third party based upon the IP which was given by the Helium Corp, and if you divide it by all those things, the percentage is very, very low, like 0 point something, I think.
Yeah, so I just Abhimanyu saying, as a percentage of the total capital required to deploy this, how much did Helium themselves have to deploy? I agree, it was a very small, very, very small fraction. Did anybody take a look at what Helium's market cap is?
Not recently, but I know for a fact that, again, when they started this whole project, is supposed to be open source, right? So anybody can build their hotspot and they can run it and open it to the public, right? So that's why they built that on Raspberry Pi, so anybody can just download the code and build their own hotspot. But now they have those outsourcing device builders. So I don't think that they're spending anything, but they're just reaping the money out of that of those deals.
Well, okay, so we've got a couple of buckets of cash. Vivek said 111 million of equity put into Helium Inc. And Abhimanyu and Romy are talking about the hundreds of thousands and later potentially millions of hotspots that cost hundreds of dollars a piece. So that's a significant amount of money. There's another big bucket of value here, though, which is the token. And the token, because they've started announcing some 5G stuff, has recently gone up a lot. It's around $50 a token right now. And what we know from earlier in the conversation is that they're inflating the token at 2.5 million units, 2.5 million HNT a month. So you're issuing $125 million a month of HNT right now, a month. And this is how it's being distributed.
Yeah. And one thing to note as well, that they do halving every 2 years. So that's an important information.
That is the halvening, and it's also really nice over, like, now that this is the fourth one we've done, you can put some like high level bullets, inflationary currency using the same halvening approach, proof of coverage, like, just so we can build, like, for me at least, it's building like a mental pattern in my head around tokens, which I've really enjoyed about this time together. The inflation, though, Michael, are you saying that of the monthly inflation, how much of that goes to the team, and can the team use for operations?
Actually, the point I was trying to drive at is, what are the hotspot owners being paid to build this network? That was really where I was going. Is like,
got it.
Is like how much money is being spread around those 300,000 and rapidly growing hotspot folks in money, and like it's not dollars, right? It's something else. And like I have demonstrated for many, many months that I would rather have HNT than dollars, but there's a lot of people that would rather have dollars than HNT. And I would rather have HNT than dollars, even though they're inflating the currency at 2.5 million units a month. So what on earth is wrong with me? Like what am I thinking? I didn't mean to personalize. I wanted to personalize just because we only have like 5 minutes left on the call. I want to focus people's attention. It's not about me. There's 100-something thousand people that own these things, and are getting paid in this made up currency that's supposedly worth $50 a unit and is getting printed at 2.5 million units a month. I think it's important, before we leave the call, that we just like kind of address. Does anybody want to talk about like inflation and like how in the inflation in the system, and what is managing that inflation, and why I would want to hold something that is inflating so rapidly, or why I and many others want to hold something that's inflating so rapidly? Anyone want to take it?
Well, I would think it's because in the future, you believe that that collective pie is going to grow big enough that it is going to outgrow the inflation that you all are experiencing. And like market cap for Verizon is probably like, I don't know, 200 billion, $300 billion. And Helium is 10. And so if you believe that Helium could become the dominant telecommunications platform for the world, there's another 10, 20 times plus of appreciation that could occur.
Yes, so that, and what I think it's just because we're running out of time, I'm going to throw just two other things in here. We talked about the halvening already, so this is your inflation rate here, but there's another really important piece of this, which is this idea of net emissions, and it's net of what? Net of the burn. So this token does get burned as a part of its as a part of how it's used. And what happens is, if you want to carry data on Helium, let's say you're one of these companies with sensors, or you're a scooter tracking company like mine, or you're doing wildfire monitoring or cold chain monitoring, or whatever it is you're putting sensors out there for, you need to buy some data transfer capabilities from Helium. The way you do that is you buy a Helium token and you burn it, and you burn it for a data credit. And the data credit is what then allows you to send your data over the Helium network. And there's an interesting mechanic where the data credits are almost like a stable coin in the system. They're pegged to a specific dollar amount. So I, as a data customer, I'm not worried about like what's the price of helium today. I just know that for every dollar I spend, I can transmit a certain number of kilobytes from all my devices over the network. And then how many of those data credits I can buy with one helium is kind of a question, whatever helium's trading at today. But but I know for purposes of planning my business, I can kind of mark my data cost to like a more stable asset like dollars. But the part of a big assumption in this business is that eventually the use of the network will exceed will result in such a high burn rate of the token that the burn rate will exceed inflation. And so and then they will need to continue to emit, they'll need to continue to issue new tokens, to either cover all of the burn or perhaps only a fraction of what is getting burned, which then results in deflating the token. And that was a protocol change from earlier this year that resulted, not surprisingly, in a bump in the value of the token, because people say, wait a second, this isn't just a token that's going to be inflating. There is this future scenario when there's so many people using helium and so many people buying data credits and so many HNT are getting burned that the token actually goes deflationary. Now that could change with protocol votes and stuff like that over the coming years or decades, as these guys posit it, which is one of my favorite things. Speaking of patterns across different things, and because there's no one from Helium on the call, and I didn't want to say this in front of Neuron, but like the idea that all these protocols are giving themselves 50-year timelines, I would never have put a 50-year timeline in front of an equity investor when I was raising money for capital. They would have just laughed me out of the room. But apparently, if you work in Web3, you're like, yeah, and over the next 50 years, we got this, no worries. And so that's like over this kind of time frame, which itself is a meme. Like the idea that helium's still going to be around in 50 years is would mean that they lasted longer than almost every other startup that's ever been founded. But they that's an interesting story, and that is why I think so many people, including myself, are willing to hold this token, is because even though it's in a very inflationary state right now, eventually the bet is that it will stabilize or go deflationary as the use of the network catches up with the scale of the network, and the chicken follows the egg, so to speak.
Yeah.
How are
Mike,
we?
I just want to volunteer that perhaps we can have a follow-up session just for the interest of time. And perhaps in the next session, I can invite some folks from Helium so we can ask directly these questions.
Sure, that'd be great. We're over time by a minute. I did more talking on this call than I wanted to. Is there anything that other folks, any questions or thing I think I can stay on for I can stay on for a few more minutes if people want to stay on and just keep chatting, because I realize we maybe didn't give ourselves enough time for this very interesting protocol. But anybody want to jump in now while we still have most folks on?
I need to leave, Mike, but I'll DM you and probably we can organize the follow-up call.
Great. Cool.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, Michael. So I think the way I was thinking about it, I mean, and yeah, like you had a very important point about this 50-year timeline, and it really sort of scares me when I look at the adaptation, like how widely the network is growing and how much they are doing on the protocol level to to ease things up, to let's say to make it in a fruitful way. Because I don't want this project to end up in a way that it's like a money-making machine where people in shorter term can come, bring like 10 miners, they can connect them anywhere, and the vicious loop of extracting rewards. So I think as of now, this adaptation is growing way faster than the protocol itself should be, both in terms of the real use case adaptation and let's say to de-incentivize such loops in the current system. I mean, I don't want to let's say raise an alarm, but when I look at this, I feel like, okay, this could be a problem in, let's say, next year or in 2-3 years.
A problem like the people who got in early made too much money and then what?
Yeah, I mean, the whole progression of the system, it's moving too fast. and the protocol is not moving that fast according to, let's say, now we have more, let's say, producers than the consumers. You know what I mean? Yeah.
So I guess when you say too fast,
yeah.
So I think it's worth maybe disentangling for a second the sort of, not that they're unrelated or that one is more important than the other, but I think there's one argument is like, does it make sense? Is it healthy for a protocol to issue a sort of outsized rewards to early participants in the network? Like, is that good or bad for any number of reasons? And then I think there's a second one, which is the network growing the right way? Is there one part of the network, independent of the token price or something like that, that's growing too fast relative to another part of the network? I think that question I think they're both actually interesting, but I'm curious if it seems like you have a stronger opinion about the latter, meaning the sort of like you basically, do you think that they've grown supply too fast relative to demand?
Well, both yes and no, because I think the supply is no issue here, but I think the supply becomes an issue when you see that the classical producer consumer problem is going to hit it in the near future. Because I think you say when you say that a lot of people, they have already moved in, so that term itself called as the initial or the early mover advantage, it's more or less out of the window right now, because it's, just look at the chart and you see yourself like it's huge right now. So I don't know, like if they are moving or they're doing enough to make sure that people actually see its true potential without, just saying, hey, it's just people come in, they put some investment and then they get this investment out in like, I don't know, like 2-3 months, while the protocol itself is not doing enough to onboard the real devices or something. For example, like in our day-to-day houses, I was hoping to get a Helium miner node, and then I was like, hey, who's going to use that? Because who, like smart fridge, smart watches, like what? Because I don't have any, let's say, IoT enabled industry or a plant nearby my house which is going to use it. So I feel like that, hey, let's apply some common sense here. And another use case, for example, there were talks of like, let's say 5G miners, so that like big companies in the US, Verizon, AT&T can maybe, take a piece of Helium and might help grow their endeavors as well. But out of these 300,000 devices, I don't think that even 5% is of 5G devices yet, because it's like Freedom Fire thingy. So this makes me a little bit curious that, hey, what if the uptick is actually a downtick in the short run? And if nothing is done in the short run, then the long run will also be a downtick.
And when you say downtick, do you mean in price, in number of hotspots, in the network, or in usage of the network? Like what goes down?
I think in projects, if I think of it as a usability standpoint, I think first thing which should hit it is the vision that, hey, it started with the vision of connecting devices, let's say reachability across low resource devices. And for example, it's been more than 5 years. There are like 1 million devices across the world, but the real data onboarding is still very less. So this is, in short, like if I have to say it in brief, I'll just say this point, that applicability is missing altogether, and the adaptation is moving too fast. And when something's moved too fast, why will people pay money for a token which is like, let's say 7-10 years away from now, at least in getting decent level network real traffic?
I guess we'll see.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
because at least Bitcoin is having some transaction, like you can transfer $1 billion for like $5 fee. That's it. Borderless. But with this thing, I feel like, okay, it has a lot of potential, but we are the consumers. We are all becoming producers right here.
Yeah, I hear your point, and I think you could say like maybe said. I mean, I think there's part of it which is sort of a diagnosis, and part of it which I think is you're saying is sort of a recommendation. I'd say you could say one thing you could say is like, hey, they've built this 300,000 hotspot network, and not very many people are using it. Therefore, this thing actually isn't that useful. Which is so I think the pushback on that would be, it only crossed 200,000 devices a few months ago, and a year ago there were like 10,000 devices on the network. So that so it's pretty new in terms of what's 10,000 hotspots globally. So you could I think the argument that the Helium folks and I as a participant in the network would make is that the network only really started to get to useful scale just even for LoRa. And then I think the second is that, frankly, the LoRa market, LoRaWAN, meaning the IoT stuff that Helium currently carries, is actually a pretty small market. And where it gets interesting is when you go to 5G or 6G or whatever is coming, later in this, 0 to 25 to 50 year timeline. That is, that's when I think it gets really, really interesting. And you could argue, well, the Helium should be doing more to incentivize demand. It seems like, other than business development, like signing up customers, which they're certainly actively doing, I don't think they're not subsidizing to the degree that I can tell the use of the network. Meaning, I mean, the use of the network is incredibly cheap already, but if you are, they're printing money hand over fist and handing it to the supply side of the network, and they don't seem to be printing money and giving a hand over fist to the demand side of the network. And I guess then the question is, if you were, foisting millions or hundreds of millions of dollars a month on potential users, would that address your concern about some sort of imbalance? And would it actually be to the long-term benefit of the network? And I think that's kind of interesting. Like, is there a reason these guys are spending $100 million a month on the supply side of their network, and spending a tiny fraction of that on the demand side? And is it because they're doing it wrong, or is it because they know something about how networks like this grow and are used that isn't obvious to those of us on the call? Anybody else want to jump in? Lisa, Sid?
Oh,
next?
I have a question. I just thought about it. I was wondering how much would it cost to actually deploy just like small base stations around the world? Does it cost more than $100 million per month? I feel like it probably wouldn't. And I understand like there's a decentralized, aspect of it, but I feel like there's also trade-off of like maybe privacy and also maybe like latency, because like for like centralized base station powers, people like, big like content providers can actually put like say CDNs or like cache boxes. Apparently you cannot do that because when it's a decentralized system. So yeah, I'm curious like how much would it actually cost if we just like put a bunch of like those small like, so as far as I know, like the Freedom Fi, that box is based on the open source software that was open source but partially by Facebook. Like there's a project called Magma, and like there's like this like what's it called, like TIP, like telco infra project thing. Anyways, it's like some sort of open source projects. So I feel like that box probably doesn't cost that much to make. So I'm just thinking if I just want to cover.
I think there's a really, really, really interesting, there's something really interesting. You say like, okay, there's 300 something thousand of them in the world right now. The average retail price was probably around $350. So let's say that the actual cost to produce one is like $100-200. Like they're not that, it's like a Raspberry Pi and an antenna and an enclosure and a power. It's like that's really all the basic ones are. So maybe it's $100. And so you say 100 times 300,000 is $30 million, which is 25% of what they're currently printing in HNT every single month.
Per month.
So what is like, so should somebody just like take $30 million and replicate the Helium network? And if they had it, could they?
And then distribute the tokens. Like say we want it to be decentralized. I feel like there might be another way to make it not a monopoly.
That's highly possible. And let me tell you, like in which one scenario it can be possible, because for example, I think you guys might have heard of the project Iotx.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in Iotx, what they do is they have a root chain and they have multiple side chains catering the use case for example, if there are some IoT devices focusing only on sensor data, they have a separate chain for that. For financial data, they have a separate chain for that. Imagine the same thing with the connectivity, for example, for low resource devices and 5G and 6G. And of course, like Helium nodes right now, they are mostly LoRa right now. And imagine, and one point is those nodes, existing low resource mining nodes, for them to adapt to 5G network, there has to be a hardware change, which is not easy. So if a consumer needs to put a lot of, let's say, some X amount of money, why not AT&T say, hey, you know what? Let me start my own chain, which serves the 6G use case. How about that? So there could be a potential entry sort of like that.
So to play that out though, this is good. We're getting into the real kind of long-term competitive nitty-gritty of this. So AT&T comes along, they do the math that Lisa just did, and they say, actually, this doesn't look that expensive. We could cover the whole world in transmitters. Or maybe they do the math that Abhimanyu did, and they say, well, the 5G ones aren't going to be $100 a piece. You know, they're going to be $1,000 a piece. But cost, to if we can buy them in bulk, et cetera.
Yeah.
If my question that raises in my mind is that AT&T is like 100-year-old company, and Verizon's been around for like 10 or 20 years. 5G, 4G, like all these technologies, all these companies spend a tremendous amount of time and money and expertise thinking about how to build out their networks. So for Abhimanyu, I think for your point to be true, they would have just sort of had to have woken up to the possibility of incentivizing people to host hotspots themselves, because the idea of wanting to have their antennas all over the world is not new.
Yeah.
And the cost of these things is not, the cost has come down a lot for a lot of stuff in electronics recently, but that wouldn't surprise anybody working at a big telco, I don't think. But is your point being that now that Helium has shown that you can actually grow a network of substantial size using token incentives and decentralized hosting of the antennas, that kind of opens the door for the big players to come in and build their own versions of it?
Don't you think the same thing happened with Ethereum? Like, of course, there were like multiple application smart contracts, and with time it became expensive. Imagine a future in which both your 5G and 6G and LoRa data blocks are going to put on the same chain. There could be a problem of fairness. For example, if 5G devices surpasses all the LoRa devices, why then, what incentive would it be in the long run? Just like we have in the case of Ethereum, there are layer 2 side chains. And I heard that a gaming company is actually building a sidechain and will eventually put the data to attain the finality or some security properties of Ethereum. So if we separate, for example, multiple channels, LoRa, 5G, 6G, and we compare it with the existing solutions that we are adopting from the problem that originated 5-6 years ago with Ethereum, I think we can end up in a similar use case when these things become real for such companies. Because if anyways you have to put a new device, why not using a separate chain altogether? And if you are using a chain, hey, Helium has no monopoly. There is no contract that is signed.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with you, but I think it's an interesting challenge to the future of Helium, whether there will be others like it that do something similar, now that they've shown that this is possible. I also recognize we're about 20 minutes over on the call, and I think we're down to 6 people. So I think we can wrap up, and maybe Romeo will organize a follow-up session for anybody who wants to join. But this has been great. Abhimanyu, thank you for joining us from outside of Kernel. Sid, thanks for inviting him, and thanks guys for sticking around through to the end of this thing. I'll post the recording later, and then we'll figure out what the next token topic is for next week.
And yeah, Michael, I would like to hear your counterpoints, because I think it will be good exercise.
Okay, thanks, man. All right, guys, have a great rest of your days.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks, Sid. Thank Michael. Thank you all.